Welcome to the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast, the untold stories of the 3HO Kundalini Yoga community. I'm your host, Guru Nishan, and I want to welcome you to another episode. As always, I like to share the reasons why I started this podcast. Number one, to break the veil of silence that has long permeated and continues to strangle the 3HO Kundalini Yoga community in the name of neutrality. Number two, to validate and help clarify the complex feelings of those who have joined this lifestyle, were born and raised into it, and or who have taught or practiced Kundalini Yoga. Number three, to encourage active listening to uncomfortable conversations from our community as a revolutionary act of self and collective healing. Number four, to let survivors know that we see them, we believe them, we love them, and we will fight for their truth to be addressed. Number five, to let teachers who are denying, gaslighting, or spiritually bypassing know that what they are doing is willfully ignorant and re-traumatizing to victims. Number six, to illuminate the inherent racism, homophobia, cultural appropriation, and exploitation that perpetuates the teachings, 3HO lifestyle, and overall community ethos. Number seven, to stop the perpetuation of gaslighting and victim shaming by naming it for what it is. Number eight, to dismantle internalized shame, guilt, toxic positivity, and light-washing mentality. Number nine, to honor all of the parts of ourselves that have been forgotten or silenced. Number 10, to honor each and every body that has come through this community, both named and unnamed. And number 11, to encourage people to do their own research, to process their own emotions, to get somatic therapy and other therapy and cult-specific therapy and support that's needed, to draw your own conclusions, and to be critical thinkers rather than to just blindly follow anyone. Please remember that your story matters. Please share it when you're ready. We're here to listen and to support you. Hello, folks, and welcome back to another episode. I'm your host, Guru Nishan. 'Tis the season for endings and beginnings. Happy New Year, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, Free Palestine. May we keep our attention on the Palestinian ethnic cleansing that is happening in plain sight as we are globally and collectively gaslit about the nature of the Zionist regime. May we not forget that our process of deculting from 3HO is within a much larger web of cults and coercion and dominator culture worldwide. May we each be doing our inner work so that we can connect these dots and show up in the liberation struggle, not just our own personal mental health struggles, personal liberation struggles, but in the collective liberation struggle that we are watching when we're witnessing a Palestinian genocide. That's not what this episode is about, but I thought I might center it for a moment since it needs to be centered in the collective West. This episode is actually a review of the Breath of Fire 4-part docu-series that was on HBO. It still is on HBO Max if you have access to it. I wanted to get some reviews of the born-in second generation to get our lens into how we felt watching it. I also asked yoga students, people that are in Facebook groups where they might have watched it. We are going to hear from some of these folks. I do have an announcement. Els Kunin and Rodolfo Caro have released part 1 of the Under the Yoga Mat Spanish translated version of the book, and it's available on Kindle. If you have Spanish-speaking people that you know need access to these stories, the Under the Yoga Mat is a very wonderful place to start, and they have done a lot of work to get this first part translated. There's also a message from Rodolfo seeking assistance in Spanish translation. So if anyone listening to this knows somebody who may know somebody who is a Spanish translator, can support and assist in any capacity in any language, but right now specifically Spanish, please do reach out. There is contact points in the show notes, so please take a look at that. Okay? I have my own thoughts and opinions on the HBO special, which I will give towards the end of this episode. But let's go ahead and start by listening to the second generation, also known as Born and Raised in the cult of 3HO Kundalini Yoga. Before we get into the reviews of the HBO series, I want to just say out loud that no docu-series is going to tell our story fully. Documentarians can only tell our story as they get to hear and get access to our stories. So there's always a bit of a disappointment in witnessing how people choose to tell our stories and what they choose to share and what they choose not to share. And so the idea of doing this review is to really support our process of integrating what it's like to have your story be told in a 4-part docuseries that ultimately falls short because it's not really telling your story. So I'm here to remind you that no one's story has been told. There has been glimpses into a story, glimpses into a lens and a perspective, but that's it. That's it. So I hope that you enjoy hearing different people's perspectives on why they did not like this docuseries, how it affected their life and their lens and their perspective. I will pick it back up and share with you my lens towards the end of the episode. Let's start by listening to Nam Kiran.
My name's Nam Kiran. I'm the Nam Kiran from Utah. I think there were 3 of us. I was born in 3HO and did go to school in India. Well, my first reaction to the show was, who the hell is this lady? That was my very first thing that came up for me. I was like, what? Who is she? And why is she wearing her turban like that? And what is going on right now? So that was my very first reaction, was like, what and why are they using this person that nobody even knows who she is? And like, what? So there was some confusion for me on my part and a little bit of irritation too about it. I'm not sure exactly why, but I did feel a little bit irritated about that for some reason. I just feel like there's so many people, other people that they could have focused on. But I'm sure they had their reasons. I did think that they did give a good general background. I felt like it was better, at least, than the Vice. The Vice I thought was terribly done. So I did feel like I kind of appreciated that they went more in depth with glad that they at least interviewed somebody from my group. Mohani, went to school with me, and I appreciated that they talked to somebody from that group, because I feel like, and I still feel like they spent a lot of time focusing on my parents' generation. I guess I can understand why people got into it and stuff like that, but we have a totally different story that's actually really fascinating and important. I feel like really important to hear because we didn't have a choice in what happened to us. So I feel like that's actually really important. I just keep feeling like there's like a really strong importance to that. I did appreciate that they talked to Mahani in the second episode and that she was able to at least talk about the school a little bit and what happened to us. I still felt like there's just so much more to say and so much more to talk about. So in that aspect, I still feel like there's this big hole that people need to share. Like, I mean, how many days were we on those Zoom calls with people telling their stories about what happened to them? This is not a normal thing that people experience in their lives. And where are those stories? Who's covering that? Who's talking about that? So I guess that was my main big reaction in general to it. Watching YB talk was really hard for me, especially when he's talking like to the parents and stuff like that about us, and like, oh, your kids are so happy over there and you're so neurotic. Or like the part where he's like, a woman deserves to be raped if, a woman asks, if a woman gets raped, it's because she asked to, and stuff like that. It made me very ragey. I felt like I needed to punch and hit things. I did go to ladies camp with my mom when I was a little kid, but mostly I was at children's camp. By the time I hit 14, my mom and my sister and I had run. from everything. So we weren't part of anything related to 3HO anymore after I came back from India. It was like, I think starting 86 to 88. So we were there, my sister and I were there for 2 years without coming home. Then when we did come home, my mother looked at us and was like, "Oh my God, what has happened to my child?" Because we were both like emaciated and sick, crawling with lice, and totally emotionally just like dead inside. Like my sister had literally physically almost died there. I don't know if she knew that. She had a terrible accident when she was there and she had to be like life flighted to Delhi and stuff. She had a really bad fall from a trapdoor in an attic and fell onto concrete on her head. Had like a hematoma on her brain and broken collarbone. And that was within the second day that she was in India. It was right after she arrived there. And I watched it happen. I was there with her and witnessed the whole accident and everything. So that was like our start. That was the beginning of our experience in India. When we came home, my mom was like, "I can't do this anymore." And my dad was like, "You don't have a choice. We have return tickets. They're going back. This is the best thing for them." So my mom waited until he was out of town, packed up the car and ran. And we hid out in somebody's basement for a couple months until she got a restraining order.
Well, geez, how about that for a testimony, huh? We'll be hearing Nam Kiran's full story in the next episode that I release on the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast. She's got quite a story. I want to share some more reviews that I collected regarding the Breath of Fire's docu-series on HBO. As a second Jenner born in the Phoenix ashram in 1975, I found the storyline revolving around Katie Griggs to be a bit derivative and sensational. I understand that her story was considered by the producers to be a sympathetic vehicle to capture a millennial audience, but it really took away from the seriousness of Mahan Kiran's testimony in episode 3, for example. In my opinion, there is so much to dive deeper into, and hopefully future projects can try to explore in depth the post-war generational zeitgeist, which led to the explosion of Eastern philosophy adopted by the boomers. Involve leading sociologists and experts in cult phenomenon within society at large and focus less on anecdotal commentary. I personally think it is very interesting how New Ageism intersected with the right wing, i.e. with QAnon. Another testimony, I found it nauseating and a bit annoying that the entire focus was on Katie Griggs, her staff and family, with a tiny sprinkling on first and second generation stories. Then the last bit grounded on the 3HO and YB here and there, but especially in the third episode with the Esri Singh Sahib video clips, was very triggering. It took me through a bad loop and brought up a bunch of ugly memories from childhood of mine and working at the ranch. Mahan Kiran's testimony was very moving and brave, and I so appreciate her speaking out. I understand why the focus was on the deceased Katie, so they could sell this, as she was known. But as a focal point, it was a shallow story and the tip of the fucking iceberg. I know that our stories as second gen are deeper, more intense, varied, and intricate. And having read the Olive Branch Report, having lived it, known it within my family and friends group, there are patterns of abuse that I suspect would repeat in many of our stories. As a cult story, I think that would be far more interesting and probably a lot more triggering. Though I know we felt we were the only ones being treated so badly, the abuse and exploitation was the pattern. His pattern, the big fat cat himself. He seems to have gotten off easier than he should in this documentary. That's just my thoughts. It felt like it missed almost the whole real story except for Mahan Kiran's moment. I was disappointed at the end of the last episode. I had somehow thought that the last episodes would be more about us, but the whole thing really was just about Guru Jagat, which I guess makes sense since that's what it was supposed to be about. I felt it didn't scratch the surface of our part of the story and just 3HO in general. Overall, it was pretty disappointing doc. I didn't know who she was until this documentary, to be honest. I think the second gen stuff was supposed to just be for context. It was a documentary about her, not about us. The way second gen was included blurred the lines between the very different experiences of second gen born in versus the newer adult converts, in my opinion. I saw one article reviewing the show where they were just mixing and matching parts of the names Guru, Yogi, Jagat, Bhajan. By the end, for the publishers of the review, this is just sensationalized for entertainment because of the whole cult thing is currently trendy. So they don't seem to care that much about the distinctions. I will say the second gen stuff, perhaps because it was not new info to me, was not as hard to watch as seeing the new people coming in to perpetuate the abuse of culture. It was a lot to watch. Guru Jagat's story felt very mundane to me, especially as I watched it. It was a sad story, to be certain. She fell victim to all sorts of things, including believing her own stories. I do think it showed a sort of minor version of how cults are formed and thrived. But somehow the abuse and manipulation they highlighted in her story made the whole thing feel kind of pointless. Like somehow they were portraying that as more important in their documentary than what happened to Mahani. The hundreds of thousands of people whose abuse lasted for decades were kind of a sideshow to something I was expecting to have a much stronger cinematic punch. It left me feeling very let down by the whole thing. I was a bit disappointed with the finish. I didn't know or care much to hear Guru Jagat's story. They landed the series pretty soft. In some ways, I took a deep breath, so perhaps that's a good thing. But I was also hoping to hear more about the impact on our generation, and that was pretty minimal throughout the series. It was a bit of a slow trombone, wah, 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 for me, in that I just didn't have much interest in Guru Jagat Katie Griggs, and 90% of it seemed to be about that. I thoroughly appreciated the Temple of Steel podcast. It's the unofficial companion podcast of the Breath of Fire series. I guess I feel that so much of the focus on her took away from the bombshell of what a fraud Yogi Bhajan and 3HO is. Like the constant comparison could lead a passive viewer thinking that what he did and built was similar to what she did and built. The part that has been so sticky and I keep thinking about is the responses of the crowd, our parents, to Yogi Bhajan's disgusting introduction of Mahani on her 18th birthday in Italy, and when he was pretending not to know the word sodomy in a lecture in regards to the Kate Felt lawsuit. Their laughter and participation in those moments was so disgusting, and it was such a big part of my trauma from growing up. That was hard to hear and to experience and to watch. Here's another one. I feel like they focused on her because it is more sensational to see a white woman in a turban rise to power in a cult than a brown man in a turban. Me and my family watched the episodes 2 and 3 tonight, and at a few points my daughter was almost crying with rage. And then the part about rape where Yogi Bhajan shared writing it off as the fault of a woman asking for it. It was definitely frustrating watching with the docu-series only scratching the surface through the eye and focus of Guru Jagat, and in many ways not really telling the story of us that were born in. My summer job as a teenager when I was home from India was working in those toner rooms in LA, calling people with a fake name like Brian Lott to verify orders the next day, and knowing how wrong this was, but being told what Yogi Bhajan said it was okay. I remember half the Sanghat in LA, my mom included, worked in the toner rooms, cold calling people. The office was next door to the Gurdwara. I couldn't handle the calls after some time, and so I got sent to pack toner boxes and ship them out. I'm in a much better space than I was last year, so it didn't affect me as much watching the series because I've already heard so much worse and was more looking to see if the docuseries could help tell our collective story so that at least people know. I'm grateful that they are at least sharing it to shed some light on things that others still in 3HO are not willing to see, and hopefully people still involved who are newer, like new yoga students, might become more aware because of this series. But the Hari Jiwan stuff is just so cringy. I knew Guru Jagat from early days with Rama TV, and I got weird vibes, and so I didn't even associate with her, and mostly was irked by the groupie vibes of Hari Jiwan crew that I sometimes sat next to during Tantric at Solstice, so they knew me because of my work. It felt odd how they were all together and idolized Hari Jiwan, the toner bandit. Like, really? In hindsight, I was in my own spell too from Yogi Bhajan. Here's another testimony of a born-in. Mahani's testimony on screen hit deep. She has so much courage to be so vulnerable in such a public way. And hopefully awareness spreads to prevent these things from happening to others. I hope she understands how much support she has and that we are so proud of her. The Katie Griggs angle was bothering me, and I couldn't put my finger on it. Katie's story was personally tragic and sad, but cultural appropriation shouldn't ever overshadow the crimes of Yogi Bhajan. So those are some of our second-gen born-in perspectives. I think that they offer a wonderful lens into the experience of what it's like to be born into a cult, to not have had choices, of the impact of this lifestyle on our identity, and what it's like to have people from the outside tell our story and often not tell it well. It's painful. It's always been painful, and it's a bit of the story of our lives. I also expanded my ask. I wanted to hear from other folks as well that perhaps maybe joined as a yoga student or as a first generation and then maybe got themselves out. So I also put a request for reviews in other Facebook group forums. So I'm going to read a few of those as well. From the perspective of someone who is not in the cult, it was primarily a story of Katie Griggs, which is a worthwhile story in and of itself. It was not without empathy for her, which I liked. At the same time, it revealed the hollow capitalistic center of what she and Hari Jiwan created around her and the kind of magical thinking that led to her going down a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories. It feels very relevant to what we see in the larger circles, so I hope it will have impact on people in the spiritual marketplace today. There are many, many guru juggets out there. I just think that's such a really important point, for all of us born in that knows that this isn't really telling our story at all. It does show the formation of a cult, right? And how even when we wake up to the abuse that's going on and we have our got out story, this coercion just carries on, and they keep teaching a new generation of yoga students who then perpetuate new levels of abuse. So in that level, it lends itself to tell the cult story. Here's another yoga person perspective. It was better than I thought it would be, showing some empathy for her and for participants. Photography that really seemed to capture personalities and situations, a sense of the hectic, driven quality of her activity. I think that hearing the Katie Griggs story and then hearing from the people that fell into the Rama cult itself was just so interesting for me, being someone who taught Kundalini Yoga kind of during this time frame between 2012 to 2017, 18-ish, and the process of my deculting from Kundalini Yoga's hold on me and my consciousness, and watching her take hold of these teachings and even get manipulated to go down rabbit holes of darkness that is really perpetuated within the pedagogy and the hierarchy of the Kundalini Yoga 3HO system. One person that speaks about this more clearly than a lot of people out here, I think, is the person who runs the wacky world of Yogi Bhajan online. Hopefully we'll be hearing her tell her testimony, because she's been a longtime vocal advocate around the cult of 3HO and speaking out loud about it since the 90s. So Kamala Rose, this is her testimony. It feels like we have wasted our lives, or big parts of our lives, and we were all complicit at one level or another. This is really hard to admit, much less deal with. What helps me is what a rip-roaring great teaching tale it all is. It is a morality play. My family calls it my never-ending story. And hey, we got out. Whether that was years ago or recently, we are free. Look around and see how cults are us. They are everywhere. Authoritarianism is becoming the norm again. Abuse of power and sociopathic leaders. Lots of people who thrive on the suffering of others' beings. We are not alone. It is the story of this world. And I think that's just a really important thing to keep in mind. I know that in my deculting process, it has been a really important thing to start to realize is that our story is not unique. The 3HO story is so not unique. White supremacy is embedded into the 3HO identity. I've done some episodes on this. And there's a much larger imperialist, colonialist, capitalist story of extraction of resource that is being told through this tale. We have to understand cults and coercion in our own personal lives and also be able to see it on a collective level. So I just really appreciated that lens into this. I also got Else Kunin's lens into it. She's my co-author, collaborator on the Under the Yoga Mat book, which again, if you haven't gotten the book, I highly recommend it. Share it with a friend. It's a really great lead-in to help people have an entry point to understand the tsunami of abuse stories that is the identity of 3HO Kundalini Yoga, regardless of what level you got brought into this culture. So I'm going to read her testimony. We have been waiting a long time for this documentary, so the risk was that it would be disappointing as we expected too much from it. But for me, it was not disappointing. It was so well done. They succeeded in putting so much into these 4 episodes. The highlights of them are for me. The way that they paint the picture of the upbringing of Guru Jagat helps us to see who she was before she took on the cult identity. How her mother raised her, they danced together. Katie loved to perform, and the rape she experienced. They gave us a pretty good idea of who she was also by interviewing her friend. I was extremely happy to see that they included the real criminal, Hari Jiwan, the toner bandit. How he cast her as the perfect individual he could mold into the person he needed for his yoga business. He has no charisma whatsoever. He's a creep all over. But she was a bright woman with charisma, a soft voice, and a love of performing. There are some images when they are both on stage, and you can see she is still a bit hesitant. But he knew that she would love to perform. He would have told her probably, "There is no karma in lying about your teacher." It is a pity they did not mention his 18 months in prison as a toner bandit. The fact that he fled to Hungary to give a workshop a few days before the first episode shows what a coward he is, and the arrogance that he had at the same time to announce the opening of a new yoga studio in Beverly Hills. It's so crazy. As a normal thinking human being, you cannot believe how these mafioso brains function. The most touching part of this documentary was Mahan Kiran's testimony, the sensitivity and respectful way in which they let her express what she had to go through without going into detail were so well done. That's where the excellence of the documentary makers is most visible. And also here, the link they make with her mother shows the difference in experiences between first and second generation people. Very well done. Overall, I also liked the way they weaved both stories through each other. Of course, it is still only a glimpse of what this over 50 years reality was, but they did a great job. So I think that that's also a really great lens into this. It's a many viewpoint lens into the value that this documentary really does bring. And at the same time, why it falls short, why it doesn't actually tell the 3HO Kundalini story. So much of watching the Katie Griggs story made me realize, like, wow, this is the way that cults morph into new versions from the original distortion, but then they have kind of new tales that get webbed and then weaved. And it's an important story, regardless of how many of us that were born in, that left in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, haven't been paying attention. And yet 20 more years of people joining since the 2000s have gotten webbed into the 3HO Kundalini Yoga Sikh Dharma lifestyle. And the Katie Griggs show really illuminates that not only did she get webbed in, but she created a following. It's such a Yogi Bhajan story in that Hari Jiwan rebuilt himself doing face readings and getting propped up by YB in the 2000s to have this kind of groupie following himself, in which he's been marrying people and kind of doing his own little sub-cult within the cult. This is how it's done. Like, I got to give it to them. The Rama TV, the whole scene, right? It's like the YB predatory formula meets the Instagram generation. I do think they threw in so much, kind of going back and forth and weaving the story, that it did fall extremely short on the second generation side, because it didn't really give a lens into us except through one person's tale, which is Mahani's tale. And we know the part she shared is a glimpse. It's not even a scratch on the surface of what she actually experienced, much less the complexity of the story that she tells and how little of it she's able to tell because the story wasn't focused on our generation of children that went to India and stuff. They got a lot in there, which is heavy, right? There's no way to encapsulate your life in a 4-part docuseries that makes you feel good about it. But this one especially didn't tell our tale, and it's just a really important thing to remember. The one thing I think I was most disappointed about was that they didn't mention the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast. There was a moment in, I want to say, episode 3, where they were talking about the floodgate of stories coming out. While I know that the focus of the docuseries was on the Guru Jagat story, what's so interesting is that these producers reached out to me to consult for their docuseries. And I asked them, why are you reaching out to me? Because I don't have a documentary-worthy story. And they reached out because of my podcast. They had been listening to the stories. They had been listening to me. So it was a bit insulting, to be honest. It was insulting enough for me to call them up and ask them, like, why did you not mention the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast? You know, there was that one screenshot where they're showing the floodgate of stories coming out. It's not like I needed them to pause and say, oh, the Uncomfortable Conversation podcast exists, but you can at least let it be known that it exists, because you know you're not telling our stories, because you don't have time to tell our stories, but you wanted access to these stories as a part of your docuseries. And that's why you reached out to me, and you wanted my support in that process. It was a very non-response. They had no reason. Like, oh, we just didn't. There's just not enough time. Which, you know, I don't buy it. I said the least you could have done is at least taken my podcast artwork and put it up on that screenshot, because you took 3 of my screenshots from YouTube and you lumped me in with a bunch of other people telling the stories at that time, which is perfectly fine because that's how it was going down. It was a floodgate of stories, right? And I wasn't the first and definitely not the last to make a platform for offering these stories. But I think they would agree, and a lot of us out here would agree, that the stories have been extremely helpful in making sense of shit that doesn't make sense. Because as we listen to each other's stories, we get to start to disintegrate, you know, and let memories come apart. So I just felt disappointed about that. I felt that it was insulting that they would reach out for my help. And of course, you know, they offered a consulting contract for me to be able to support them in their docuseries, which, you know, I negotiated and did what I needed to do in regards to them asking for my services. But when it came to them asking for exclusive rights to my podcast and to tell these stories in their series, I wouldn't give them exclusive rights. And I told them specifically, I can't give you exclusive rights to other people's stories. Our stories have been silenced long enough. So I'm not going to let you silence anybody's story and have it only be the rights of you to tell it. I will absolutely let you have access to the story if we get the person whose story it is, we get their consent to be included in your documentary. Like, I was willing to let the stories be included in the telling, but I wouldn't give them the exclusive rights that they wanted. So I know why they didn't include my podcast, but it's insulting that they won't admit it and that they excluded it. And it's not just insulting because I think that the podcast should get that kind of platform, which I do, but it's insulting because the reason that I wouldn't give exclusive rights was because our stories are not for sale. And I told them that. And if they know they don't have time to be able to tell our story, and yet they want to say they did the best they could, and I really do think they did a great job and getting a lot in there, the least you could do is make sure that the viewers that are watching it could listen to some of our actual stories. Like, what the hell actually happened to the kids that went to school in India? So that was probably one of my main disappointments. But the empty answer when I called and talked to the producers is what was really extra. That's what was really extra. This is a nonprofit endeavor for me. I don't mind making money in offering my services, but I'm not going to make money by selling your stories or my stories, you know? So yeah, there's that. Overall, I have to say that I think it's fantastic that the Guru Jagat story is being told on HBO. I am ecstatic that I can be like, have you watched the HBO special? And that anybody that's goo goo gaga over Kundalini Yoga and isn't choosing to listen to the survivor stories yet or read under the yoga mat to really understand the complexity of carrying on to teach Kundalini Yoga without listening to survivor stories and the rape culture that lives therein. It's just fantastic that the Rama TV, the whole Rama scene, that's getting exposed because Hari Jiwan goes on, right? White Sun goes on. These cults go on regardless of your relationship to 3HO or your chosen non-relationship to 3HO. Like these cults go on. And so we all need resources like the HBO special to give people a pierce into the veil of their consciousness when it comes to these spiritual spaces that are predatory. So I am really grateful for the HBO special for that. I'm grateful for all those that were involved in the telling of the Rama exposure, the Rama Wrong group. I think the telling of the Rama tale is just so essential. And I want to say thank you to Charlotte and thank you to Elizabeth and just everybody who spoke about their experience directly with under the influence of Hari Jiwan and Katie Griggs. It was just really important. And I think it's important for all the born-ins to hear and to witness and to see. This stuff continues to morph and there's just entirely new generations of people that get sucked into the Kundalini Yoga web. So I hope that it motivates you to contribute and tell your story because your story is so valuable. What happened to you in India matters. And it's not just something that should be private, it's something that deserves to be in the public domain. Your story deserves to be told. And the more we can tell the stories, the less deniers can have reasons to not look at the arsenal of information that's out there. I'm happy for that overall. I think we knew ahead of time that this wasn't going to be our story, right? You just hope that you're working with storytellers that want to be in integrity, that say what they mean and mean what they say, and then show up being people of their word, right? Not excluding voices that are necessary and speaking honestly about where you're getting your information. Like, at least own up. The Uncomfortable Conversations podcast matters. And while it might not have been a part of the tidal wave of the Katie Griggs story, it's definitely been a part of the tidal wave of people's healing process in recovery of 3HO. I think the most potent and powerful part for me about watching this series was at the end. It was a quote by Elizabeth Grignon, who was the former bookkeeper at Rama. And she talks about the selfishness of those that are carrying on teaching Kundalini Yoga because they say, it was so transformative for me. It worked for me. Those bad things didn't happen to me. And that quote just gave me chills. That really summed up, how I feel about people who are carrying on to teach Kundalini Yoga without integrating the abuse stories at the forefront of that conversation. To continue wearing the uniform of all white and wearing turbans and perpetuating the fake names that we got identified with as a center point for selling your specialness. it's a really interesting thing to try to dissect. And if one is going to continue to do that, one also has to be willing to examine what that means. You're basically perpetuating rape culture. So I just really liked that quote. Let's see if we can listen to a clip of it.
To know how this was created and the victims it created, and yet you're using this for your own personal gain, because that's what it is. You're saying it works for me. It's good for me. So I'm going to do it without acknowledging where it came from. You know, like I say, you can make a great meal out of something that came out of a dumpster, but you should really let people know you're serving them food that came out of a dumpster.
You should at least let them know you're serving food that you got out of a dumpster. And I couldn't have encapsulated it better. If you're going to carry on perpetuating and teaching Kundalini Yoga in any capacity for your livelihood, for your sainthood, for your servitude, in whatever reason that you have for it, at least let people know the history, the dark history that also exists. There's plenty, ample stories being told. Now we cannot have any reason that people are denying it except for choosing to not listen, which we already know, but this just really hit it home for me. Overall, I just want to say that I'm extremely proud of every single person who spoke in the documentary series. It takes a tremendous amount of courage to have a story from a coercive cult experience and to be willing to tell it in a public forum. Whether you're a first generation, whether you're a yoga student that came in anywhere in the 2000s, whether you were a born in from the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s plus, we all have a different lens of experience and different lived experience that are intricate and complex. And there's no easy way to tell it. One of the biggest reasons and ways in which I was an advocate of this documentary series and working with these producers was to encourage people to tell their stories. And they knew they couldn't tell a very good story if people didn't tell their stories. I won't say that I influenced who spoke and didn't. I don't think I influenced that. But I know that the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast does influence a lot of people, and it helps us make sense of things that don't really make a lot of sense. Hearing each other's stories does that for us because our identities were formed in the web of each other's experiences. I wish they would have acknowledged the importance of this podcast to support all the viewers that see the HBO Docu-Series and to kind of tip a hat to letting us know that they didn't tell our story. I think they missed the ball on that one. But I'm proud of every one of you who did speak up and share your story. Steering your own car, so proud of you, man. It's a very complex thing to be the abuser in somebody else's story when you too have just been a victim of an identity you didn't choose. It's complex. It's not an easy tale. It's not an easy tale to tell 5, 6, 7 hours of your life and have 30 seconds of it be shared in a docuseries. Mahani, we love you. We find you so courageous, and we know that this was just a glimpse into your story. And that it's not easy to be a public figure and to have to tell a testimony as if you have it all together. And there's not one of us here that thinks that you have to have it all together or that you've told your whole story. We're here for you when and if you need us. To all of the Rama people, Charlotte and Elizabeth, and I'm sorry I don't know the rest of your names right now, but thank you for your courage to come out and to be so vulnerable and to let us see into your experience. To the wrong chick, thank you so much for being who you are. I just really appreciated that time. And if any of you want to come and tell your story on the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast, please reach out. You'll be hearing from a couple of them soon. We already are in contact. But anyone else, if you're listening to this and you want to tell your story, please know that this platform is available. It is for the sole purpose of making sure that the untold stories have a public platform and that when people are ready to listen to them, they are available. I think it's a really important thing. I know that it's really helped me in my recovery and CPTSD recovery process, to listen to your stories, to be humbled by your stories, to recognize readiness in someone telling their story, and to recognize when people reach out and they're not ready. They need to be heard, but they don't necessarily need to be heard on a podcast yet. There is a difference, and I believe that each and every one of us deserve to be heard. So I hope that you are getting the therapy and the support that you need. I myself have been using cult support groups as a tremendous support system for me over the last year. I also am doing personal therapy, and, my therapists aren't always as good as I wish they were. I don't have a cult-specific therapist quite yet, but it is something that I desire, and I encourage, no matter what form of support and therapy you can get, every single one of us deserves to be listened to unconditionally with no need for reciprocation. And that's why I encourage you to get someone to talk to make sense of things that aren't supposed to make sense. I'm so extremely grateful for the voices of Stacy Stukin and Slip and them contributing their lens. Jules, so proud of you as well. I know that was extremely hard. It just is never easy to let a portion of your existence be shown on the public stage because there's so much more to you. There's so much more to your experience. Thank you for the work of Else Kunin. She's out there being an advocate and trying to spread the word about the contradictory nature of cults and what's happening in the continued perpetuation of cultic abuse in 3HO, and how this is perpetuated through our musicians, through our artists, through our teachers, people that are not highlighting the underscore of abuse and carrying on using their public persona to grow their Kundalini Yoga spiritual persona empire. It's pretty powerful work. There are going to be a lot more published documents to support these stories getting out in Europe. Else Kunin's in Belgium, getting the stories in Italian. A lot of effort is going into getting these in Spanish because they are putting a lot of energy into the international lens. Remember, each one of these multi-level marketing tentacle legs are off perpetuating their kind of Aquarian sadhana school. Every one of us who starts to speak out supports the inability of that cult to be able to continue to spread worldwide without disruption. And a simple disruption is you hear somebody talking about Kundalini Yoga and you say, oh, have you heard of Under the Yoga Mat? It's a book I highly recommend anybody who's teaching Kundalini Yoga. It really shows the dark history of the kids that were born in to the community and the impact worldwide. I highly encourage each and every one of us to be advocates and activists in stopping the perpetuation of coercive control in all the forms that it decides to morph, distort, and rebrand itself. And if Breath of Fire did anything well, it showed us how the 3HO Yogi Bhajan predatory formula has not only morphed itself through Guru Dev Singh and the Satnam Rasayan brand, but through all the different tentacles of different Kundalini yoga schools worldwide, whether it's the Kadam Kriya school in Europe or just the different schools in France or South America or Mexico or China. In Russia, Hari Jiwan is just such a good example of that perpetuated morphing of the cult and how he's slowly changing the story a little bit to have his lineage track to Tibet instead of to India. And so it's just so interesting to watch these cults quite literally rebrand themselves in real time, which I think Else Kunin's testimony kind of showed that. It's like we all have to be on alert because these things are in active morphing. We have to move beyond just disgust that Kundalini Yoga continues to perpetuate itself, but that it continues to perpetuate itself with billions of dollars behind it because people don't want to give up their public persona as the spiritual Kundalini Yoga guru, high consciousness, whatever. It's just an interesting thing to pay attention to. I thank you all again for telling your stories, even if it's done not so well. I think that it's still worth every single one of us contributing to the story being told, because the more people that come forward and tell their stories, the better lens into our lived experience people will get. I really respect that it might not be your time to tell your story. Just remember that your story does matter. What happened to you matters. Even when you can glean really good things from the experiences, remember that that's just a part of our own coping mechanism, because that is what was necessary. We didn't have any other option but to keep up. To keep up and keep it moving. Just because it worked in the past doesn't mean it has to keep working in the future. We all have the right and the grace to get support, whatever that might mean for you. I want to thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast, the untold stories of the 3HO Kundalini Yoga community. If you yourself have a story that you'd like to contribute to the podcast, please reach out to me at gn@gurunishan.com. If you'd like to contribute to this podcast, please head over to the link in my bio. It is my gurunishan.substack.com or conversationsyoucanfeel.com. And you can contribute a one-time or monthly or annual donation to support these podcasts. So please spread the word. If you have a story that you want to share, please reach out and I'd be more than happy to give you that space to contribute to this wealth of a tapestry of the untold stories of the 3HO Kundalini Yoga culture. Thanks for tuning in, folks. I'm Guru Nishan, and thank you for supporting this podcast.